Here's something almost nobody talks about honestly. Most couples don't have a sex problem. They have a desire gap, and those two things are completely different, have completely different causes, and need completely different solutions. One of them is fixable. Both of them are more common than you think. And if you've been in a relationship longer than 2 years, there's a better than even chance you already know exactly what I'm talking about. So, let's actually get into it. Sexual desire in humans isn't a single thing. That sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but the model most people are working with, this idea that desire is basically a gas gauge that's either full or empty, is wrong in a way that quietly causes a lot of damage. The research on this has gotten genuinely sophisticated in the last 15 years, and the picture that's emerged is much more interesting than "he wants it more than she does." There are two distinct systems at play. Researchers call them the SIS and the SES, the sexual inhibition system and the sexual excitation system. Think of them as the gas pedal and the brake. Most people go through their entire lives only thinking about the gas pedal, what turns desire on. But the brake is at least as important, maybe more so, and almost nobody talks about it. Here's what that means in practice. The excitation system is what responds to opportunity, to stimuli that your brain has tagged as sexual. The inhibition system is what monitors for threats, stress, distraction, relationship tension, body image concerns, performance anxiety, the fact that you just had an argument about the dishwasher. The inhibition system doesn't care how attractive your partner is. It doesn't care how long it's been. It just knows there's a threat signal in the environment, and it hits the brakes. And here's the thing that matters for this conversation. People differ enormously in the sensitivity of these systems. Some people have a hair trigger excitation system, high desire, responsive to a lot of different cues, not easy to derail. Some people have a very sensitive inhibition system, smart, thoughtful, often high-achieving, easily knocked off course by stress or context. Most people are somewhere in between, and critically, these traits are largely fixed. They're not a choice. They're not a character flaw. They're wiring. So, when you have two people in a long-term relationship and one of them seems to want sex significantly more than the other, you're often looking at two people with different sensitivity profiles, not one person with a healthy sex drive and one person who has a problem. That reframe matters because the way a couple interprets the gap determines almost everything about whether the gap gets better or worse. There's this concept in the research called the demand withdrawal pattern, and it shows up in study after study on couples with mismatched desire. The higher desire partner initiates, gets turned down, or senses reluctance, initiates again, gets rejected again. Over time, they start to feel unwanted, sometimes resentful, sometimes desperate, sometimes both. And the lower desire partner, they start to feel pressured, monitored, like sex has become a performance obligation rather than something they get to want. And here's the brutal irony. Pressure is one of the strongest activators of the inhibition system. So the more the higher desire partner pushes, the more the lower desire partner's brake engages. The gap widens. Everyone feels worse. The demand withdrawal pattern doesn't just affect how often couples have sex. The research shows it's one of the strongest predictors of overall relationship dissatisfaction in both partners, not just the one being rejected. If this is landing for you right now, if you're recognizing something here, drop a comment below. Not to vent, though you can do that too, but because I'm genuinely curious how many people watching this have been in one of those roles. Both sides of that pattern are painful in different ways, and I don't think either side gets talked about honestly enough. Alright, let's go a layer deeper because the neurochemistry of long-term desire is where this gets really interesting, and where I think a lot of the common advice completely misses the point. There's a well-documented phenomenon sometimes called habituation, the idea that desire tends to decline as novelty declines. New relationship energy is real, and it has a neurochemical basis. The early stages of attraction involve dopamine, norepinephrine, elevated testosterone in both sexes. It's basically a controlled neurochemical cocktail that makes your partner constantly interesting. Over time, the brain's reward circuitry adapts. The signal gets quieter. This is normal. It happens to almost everyone. But the rate at which it happens and how far it goes varies enormously. What the research shows, and this is the part that actually matters, is that novelty is the primary driver of spontaneous desire. But novelty within a relationship isn't dead just because the relationship is long. What changes is where novelty has to come from. Early on, it's just the person. Everything about them is new. Over time, novelty has to come from context, from experience, from growth, yours and theirs. Couples who figure out how to keep introducing genuine novelty don't experience the same degree of habituation as couples who fall into rigid patterns. And I want to be specific here, because try new things is advice so vague, it's basically useless. The research on what actually works is more precise than that. It's not about novelty in the bedroom, primarily, though that can help. It's about novelty in the relationship, shared experiences that produce genuine arousal, excitement, or mild anxiety, things that activate the autonomic nervous system together, have been shown to spill over into sexual desire. The classic study on this had couples either do a mundane task or a genuinely challenging, exciting physical activity together. The couples who did the exciting activity reported significantly higher attraction and relationship satisfaction afterward. Your nervous system doesn't always cleanly separate "I'm excited about this" from "I'm excited about you." That's a feature, not a bug, and you can use it deliberately. Now, there's another piece of this that almost nobody mentions in these conversations, and it has to do with what researchers call responsive desire versus spontaneous desire. This is one of the most clinically useful distinctions in the literature on sexual function, and it's barely in the mainstream conversation at all. Spontaneous desire is what most people think of when they think of sex drive. You're sitting there doing nothing in particular, and desire just appears. Responsive desire is different. It doesn't emerge spontaneously. It emerges in response to stimulation, physical, emotional, contextual. It gets going once you're already going. Here's what the research shows. Spontaneous desire is significantly more common in men and in the early stages of relationships. Responsive desire is significantly more common in women and in long-term relationships. For both sexes, that last part is key. Over time, even people who had highly spontaneous desire earlier in life or earlier in the relationship shift toward more responsive desire. This isn't dysfunction. This is a documented, normal developmental trajectory. But if you don't know about this, if you're in a couple where one person is waiting to feel like it before initiating, and the other person is interpreting that as a lack of desire, you end up in a standoff. The lower spontaneous desire partner never initiates because they don't feel it yet. The higher spontaneous desire partner either initiates and gets lukewarm engagement or doesn't initiate and gets nothing. And both people end up confused and a little bit hurt. The clinical insight here is simple once you understand it. Responsive desire is legitimate desire. It's not settling. It's not going through the motions. It's just a desire pattern that needs a little runway. A person with primarily responsive desire who engages with sex, even when they didn't feel like it spontaneously, often reports genuine enjoyment and connection afterward. Not always, but often, and that changes the calculus for both people. If this is the kind of content you actually want more of, not just the surface level stuff, but the actual research broken down in a way that's useful, hit subscribe. This is what we do here. And if you know someone navigating this specific situation, send them this video. You're not giving them advice. You're just giving them better information. Sometimes that's enough. Okay, Let's talk about what the research actually recommends, because I want to be specific. The most evidence-backed intervention for couples dealing with desire discrepancy isn't a supplement. It isn't a frequency target. It's communication, but not the kind most people think of when they hear that word. Not a long, serious conversation where you both air grievances. That can actually make things worse if it happens without the right frame. The communication that moves the needle is what researchers call sexual self-disclosure, the ongoing practice of clearly and non-judgmentally sharing what you want, what you like, what's been on your mind, what's gotten in the way. Studies show that couples who practice this kind of disclosure report higher sexual satisfaction, higher relationship satisfaction, and smaller desire gaps over time. Not because the disclosure solves everything, but because it keeps the channel open. It prevents the buildup of resentment and misreading that feeds the demand-withdrawal spiral. What's interesting about the research is that the frequency of sex matters less than most people assume. What matters more is whether both partners feel wanted, whether sex is experienced as chosen rather than obligated, and whether there's a sense of mutual attunement. The feeling that your partner is actually present with you, not just performing a task. Those three things predict sexual satisfaction better than frequency does, in almost every study. There's also a conversation worth having about testosterone here, because it's central to male libido and it intersects with everything I've talked about. Testosterone isn't a libido switch, but it's a floor. Below a certain threshold, spontaneous desire drops significantly. Motivation for sex becomes harder to access, and responsive desire may still function, but spontaneous desire is blunted. This is more common in men over 35 than the general awareness suggests. The research on this is unambiguous. Low testosterone is strongly associated with reduced libido, and treatment of clinically low testosterone consistently improves it. But here's the nuance that often gets lost. Testosterone also rises and falls in response to relationship and behavioral factors. Men in relationships where sex is frequent, positive, and emotionally connected tend to have higher testosterone than men in relationships where sex is rare, tense, or largely absent. It's bidirectional. The desire gap doesn't just reflect testosterone levels, it can influence them, which means addressing the relationship dynamics isn't just good for the relationship, it's literally good for your hormonal baseline. Stress is the other major variable, and I want to give it its due here because it's underestimated. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, is physiologically antagonistic to testosterone. They share biosynthetic pathways. When cortisol is chronically elevated, testosterone production is suppressed. Chronic work stress, poor sleep, financial pressure, all of it lands directly on the hormonal environment that governs libido. If you're dealing with a desire gap and both partners are under significant stress, you're not dealing with a relationship problem first. You're dealing with a physiological problem that's expressing as a relationship problem. The sequence matters for how you address it. There's one more thing I want to cover, and it's the thing that probably matters most, not just for managing the desire gap, but for the long-term trajectory of a relationship. The research on couples who successfully maintain desire over decades, genuinely, not just tolerating each other, consistently points to something that's harder to operationalize than communication scripts or schedule changes. It's a quality of attention. Specifically, the practice of treating your partner as someone who still surprises you, not performing curiosity about them, actually being curious, continuing to ask questions you don't already know the answer to, noticing when they've changed and acknowledging it, maintaining the assumption that there's more to them than you've already mapped. This sounds soft, but the attachment research behind it is robust. Relationships where partners continue to see each other as full, complex, evolving people rather than known quantities, comfortable pieces of furniture in the landscape of their lives, show significantly more sustained desire, more emotional intimacy, and more sexual satisfaction. Philosopher Alain de Botton has a line about this. The idea that eroticism requires distance, a degree of unknowing. The research doesn't disagree. Familiarity is an asset in a relationship, but total predictability is desire's quiet enemy. And familiarity doesn't have to mean predictability. That's a choice. So here's where we land. The desire gap in long-term relationships is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It's a predictable consequence of neurochemical adaptation, evolving desire patterns, and two people with different inhibitory and excitatory wiring trying to navigate a shared life under real-world conditions. Understanding that doesn't make it easy, but it makes it navigable. The gap usually isn't about attraction. It usually isn't about love. It's usually about context, communication, stress loads, and a model of desire that's too simple to be useful. Replace the model, reduce the inhibition load, build actual pathways for responsive desire to function, and keep enough novelty and mutual curiosity in the relationship to prevent the full flatline, and the gap becomes manageable for most couples. That's not a guarantee, but it's a significantly better starting point than something is wrong with one of us. If this gave you something to think about, or something to bring to a conversation you've been putting off, that's what this channel is for. Hit like if this was worth your time. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on this stuff. We cover everything from the hormonal to the psychological to the practical, and we don't dress it up or dumb it down. Share it with someone who would appreciate it. And whatever you're working through, you've got more tools now than you did 15 minutes ago. That's a decent place to be. This content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute relationship, psychological, or medical advice. If you and your partner are struggling with these issues, a licensed therapist or sex therapist can provide support tailored to your specific situation.